There has always been a debate over the level of control a creator has over its creation once it's been released to the world. Once a film hits the theater or an album hits the shelf, it's largely a finished product. Any alterations that can be made require an entirely new product to be created. Video games are a little different though. Especially in modern times, developers can push out updates that change the game in any number of large or small ways, oftentimes with the player having no choice in the matter. In a field where few words are as important as consistency, speedrunners face no threat more existential than the whims that an incredulous developer poses. While most developers view speedrunning with anything from enthusiasm
What's happening right now? What's happening right now?
To apathy,
and it just never gets any defense.
That's more of a camera bug.
a few are outwardly antagonistic towards speedrunners, doing everything they can to make the run as slow as possible.
Hey, Tom Brady, you want to play the game or do you just want to be known as a smug cheating bitch the rest of your life?
It's safe to say that these developers hate speedrunning. But before we start, as a speedrunner, I don't want to waste your time, so I'll just skip to thanking you for subscribing. Over the past decade, indie horror has exploded as a video game genre. Around this time, YouTube changed from prioritizing videos and channels based on the amount of views it was receiving to one that rewards channels depending on the watch time it generated. This incentivized content that would retain a viewer's attention, while also emphasizing channels that could consistently upload videos. In doing so, YouTube created a perfect storm for the rise of Let's Plays, leading to channels like PewDiePie and Markiplier to take the website by storm, propelled especially by horror games. Since then, franchises like Five Nights at Freddy's have gone on to be among the most recognizable brands in the world, leaving a wave of similarly brandable, vaguely cartoony mascot horror games in its wake. One of the most popular of these offspring games is Poppy's Playtime. Despite the game's warm reception, one criticism was the game's short length. The developers tried to address this when they released the game's second chapter, which was roughly twice as long as the first. By this point, a sizable speedrunning community had sprung up around the game. Within the first 24 hours of the release, Chapter 2 speedruns were already under 6 minutes. Within a few weeks, the run was approaching the 3-minute mark, with over 2 minutes of that time being a cutscene at the end. The game begins with the player spawning into Poppy's bedroom, and is broken from the get-go. The central mechanic of the game is the player's elastic hands. The starting configuration is the left hand being blue and the right hand being red. While the game's loading, runners spam right-click. Doing this causes the player's right arm to go on an adventure. However, when the right arm returns as a conquering champion, you'll notice that it's green instead. The green hand is supposed to be an upgrade that the players make midway through the game after losing the red hand. While the red and blue hands are functionally the same, the green hand has the added ability of conducting electricity. From here, runners proceed to a fork in the road with a door in between. At this point, the game expects the player to go to the right and get a key that opens the door. This door leads the player to Poppy, as well as lets them turn on the power, which is needed to open the left door. Now, at first glance, the left door presents a bit of an issue. The locks above the door indicate that they require a blue and red hand to unlock. This isn't just a cosmetic issue. Using the green hand on the red lock will not open the door. While runners could delay getting the green hand by reloading after the door and spamming right-click, this would obviously be slower than getting it initially. At any rate, the developers made the order the players should go in very clear, but you know speedrunners. By approaching the wall to the left of the door, you could just walk straight through it. No glitches or anything, this wall just didn't have collision. Out of bounds now, when playing at 30 FPS, the player can fall to the ground and grab a nearby handle. Next, the player needs to jump into the air, then release the handle and spam click with the hand that was previously holding the handle. The game will launch the player into the direction they're looking. This can be used to travel a massive distance all the way to the train station at the end of the game. Now, normally, even though the train station is at the end of the game, this is a bit disingenuous. In fact, this is where most of the game takes place. Normally, the player arrives here after losing the red hand. They then must make a new green hand before proceeding through a series of puzzles in order to obtain the passcode to the train door. There are a few components to the train that are necessary to finish the game. The first is the green hand. Entry to the control room is locked behind a green hand button. Without the hand, the player is unable to access the passcode. Luckily, due to spamming right-click, speedrunners enter the train station with this condition already satisfied and can immediately open the door. This still leaves the code though. There are 3 parts of the code, each with 4 components. First is the order of the symbols, followed by the symbols' colors, with the last being the sequence the buttons should be pressed. Assuming there are no repeats, one would expect that each of these parts of the code has 24 possible combinations, resulting in guessing the lock as a whole being a 1 in 13,824 chance. As luck would have it though, neither the order of symbols nor their colors are randomized, and the button sequence is determined at the start of a playthrough. This means that, at the start of any run, the runner has 2 out of the 3 parts of the code, and the hand to enter the train, with the only segments left being launching across the map and a 1 in 24 guess. With these strats, runners quickly brought the world record down to just over 3 minutes. Now, if this is where the story ended, Poppy's playtime would just be a standard, if broken, speedrun. This all changed when the developers Mob Games released the May 25th update, dubbed by David Barron as the Anti-speedrun update. In the current development cycle, with games being released in shockingly undercooked states, patches are an increasingly necessary part of the process. They allow developers to correct bugs that slipped through initial testing and made it into the release copy, polish incomplete portions, and make general quality of life improvements. However, patches allow developers with more malicious intentions to target specific aspects of the gameplay experience and adapt them to more closely align with their desired playstyle. Rather than using this patch to address problems that affected their player base as a whole, Mob Games opted to target speedrunners. When looking for problems to fix in a game, one would expect that developers would focus on the most frequently encountered ones. Since getting the green hand early being among the easiest glitches to perform, with someone being able to get it on complete accident, patching it would sensibly be one of Mob Games' top priorities. However, while this patch addressed green hand early, it did so in a manner which still left it broken for a casual playthrough, but useless in a speedrun. Upon loading in, spamming the right click button will still give the player a green hand. Walk far enough down this hallway though, and the player will enter a trigger which will switch the hand from green to red. This still allows someone to break the game to the same extent it was previously useful in casual play, but greatly impedes speedrunning. The next thing that was patched is far more excusable. A wall missing collision, especially this close to the beginning of the game, and as importantly placed as this one, is something which should have never made it past playtesting. Still, it dramatically alters the speedrun, forcing players to proceed normally. One of the most egregious changes was made to the swingers and grapples. The developers implemented a cap on swinger speeds to prevent players from being able to move too quickly. While there's clear logic to such a cap, this is the speed the developers decided to set it to. At such a painfully slow speed, the patch doesn't just negatively impact speedrunners, it makes the experience worse for casual players. It's hard to imagine anyone willfully choosing to make an experience more tedious for seemingly no reason. The most impactful change to the speedrun though was made to the train code. Now, even if the runner inputs the correct combination, the code will not be accepted until the player beats the game's villain. This completely removes the possibility to skip large sections of the game while also not benefiting the casual experience. With a single patch, the developers completely ruined an otherwise promising speedrun, and these were just patches relevant to the 90% category. Mob Games targeted even more speedrunning strats which had no impact on casual playthroughs in the all minigames and 100% categories. A simple way to measure the impact these patches had on speedrunning is to look at the leaderboards. The PC port of the game is divided between versions 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2. Across all the 80% subcategories, there are 439 runs on 1.0, while not a single run has been submitted for 1.1 and 1.2. This pattern largely continues in all minigames and 100%. In total, 1.0 has 580 runs submitted, 40 runs have been submitted to the 1.1 categories, and 1.2 has a whopping 3 runs. It goes without saying that fixing games that are broken is a good thing when done correctly, but when a broken game remains broken, and the fixes that were made disproportionately impacts an otherwise engaged part of the game's fanbase, it's fair to suggest that the developers may have an anti-speedrunning agenda. Other times though, developers send more mixed messages about what they think of speedrunning. Hollow Knight is one of the most popular speedruns of all time. The game was released in 2017 by Team Cherry and is a Metroidvanian platformer. Following its February release, it quickly became a staple of games done quick, receiving entry into the Summer Marathon mere months after its release, and has since been featured in 10 different events. With the run being a success and Hollow Knight only growing in popularity, GDQ would again showcase the game at both AGDQ 2018 and 2019. In fact, for AGDQ 2019, Hollow Knight was the very first run of the marathon. The run was performed by visuals. As the game progresses, money slowly trickles into the marathon. Suddenly though, at just before the 42-minute mark of the run, it shoots up by $10,000. It wasn't until 8 minutes later that it was revealed who the donation came from.
Here. We have a $10,000 donation from Team Cherry 251. Oh my goodness.
Thank you, guys.
While it isn't uncommon for developers to donate during GDQ, it's far from the norm. Such an outward showing of support is typically only done by developers who actively champion speedrunning, but this isn't really the case for Team Cherry. 2018 saw Team Cherry approach speedrunning differently. Despite also being featured at AGDQ that year, there was no donation for the development team. Instead, what speedrunners received was an update which fundamentally changed many parts of the run. The Lifeblood update was released in April of that year. The update had a wide-ranging impact on gameplay, including speedrunning strats. One of the most significant was changes made to a technique known as E-Pogo, or Explosion Pogo. In Hollow Knight, the Knight has the ability to attack downward using their nail while they're airborne. In addition to this being used to attack enemies, it can also be used on many other objects such as spikes. In addition to dealing damage, it also propels the Knight upwards. Pogoing is essential for navigating certain areas and is necessary for reaching those otherwise inaccessible places. While this was an intentional choice by the developers, it can be used to sequence break the game in unintended ways. One such instance is obtaining Mantis Claw early. Mantis Claw is an ability that the player can collect while traversing Hollow Nest. It allows the Knight to perform wall jumps, opening up a significant amount of movement options and allowing the player to progress through the game more easily. Normally, to get this ability, it's necessary to go to the bottom of the fungal wastes, then enter the Mantis Village. From here, the Knight can make their way through the room and collect the claw. However, the way the level is designed, it's impossible to enter it from the back. At the bottom of the fungal waste is an exit from the Mantis Village. While this can be used to skip to the very end of the village, it's designed to only be entered once the player has Mantis Claw. Speedrunners were able to get around the lip of a rock and onto the ledge by using a pogo though. At first glance, there would appear to be nothing useful. However, above this rock is an enemy which launches a spore at the player when it's attacked. This spore will follow the player. If the player attacks the spore, this will cause it to explode. In patches before the Lifeblood update, it was possible to perform a pogo off this explosion, launching the player upwards and allowing them to dash onto the ledge. The Lifeblood update changed this. Now, the explosion itself can no longer be used for pogoing, despite other damage-causing entities still being pogoable. This required runners to re-examine how to do the skip, resulting in setups which pogo off the spore itself, which, due to its significantly smaller size, made the trick more precise. This is just one of several ways Team Cherry made speedrunning more difficult. Prior to Lifeblood, if the player opened the inventory while in midair, the Knight's fall speed would be uncapped, allowing them to enter freefall. Given the vertical nature of many parts of the game, this saved significant chunks of time. The update patched out the ability to open the menu while in the air. This required speedrunners to again find a workaround. When the player opens the menu, the Knight continues to move for one physics frame. By timing opening the menu properly, the player could line it up so that they were on the ground on the frame the button is pressed, but in the air for the menu to open. Since the menu still uncaps falling speed, this allows players to still enter freefall, but it's significantly harder. The game's physics run at 50 frames per second, meaning that players have a window of 0.02 seconds to press the button. To illustrate how precise the timing is, here are a few clips. The screen will change color on the frame runners need to pause this game. See if you can pause on the frame. The update also had a significant impact on true ending runs of the game. The Dream Nail is a weapon that can be used to extract essence from spirits. In true ending runs, this weapon is used to collect essence from the warrior dreams. This is necessary as completing the true ending requires the Knight collect 2400 essence so that they're recognized as the hero the Moth Tribe has been waiting for. There's a total of 3208 essence in the game, with the warrior dreams providing 1100, making it mandatory to beat at least some of them. Once a warrior is defeated, an animation plays where the Knight absorbs its essence, during which the Knight is supposed to be unable to move. Prior to the Lifeblood update, it was possible to buffer Dream Nail inputs after each other. Doing so allowed the player to regain control of the Knight, even when the animation was still going. This was patched out by the Lifeblood update. Since 7 Dream Warriors are fought, this amounts to a pretty significant amount of time loss. While alternate cutscene skips have been found for 2 of the fights, the time loss still amounts to around 40 seconds between pre- and post-patch runs. Still though, it's unfair to categorize every change Team Cherry made as disadvantageous to speedrunners. In a game with as much depth as Hollow Knight, routing is oftentimes as important as finding tricks or optimizing movement. Deciding what weapons and attacks to go for is critical to being able to quickly progress through boss fights and other enemies. In 1.2.2.1 runs, runners would collect for the Shade Soul upgrade to the Vengeful Spirit spell. This was due to it being the fastest tier 2 spell that players could collect. It was also partially gone for out of necessity. One of the other options is Howling Wraiths and its upgrade, Abyss Shriek. This was seen as unviable though, due to a glitch that could occur where the hitbox of the spell would disappear. Not only did the 1.4 update to the game see this bug patched, the spell was also buffed significantly. This made the spell viable for beating mid-game bosses on its own, resulting in the category being rerouted to take advantage of this different option. This version would also see a reworking of how some boss fights worked. In Hollow Knight, if certain bosses are hit enough times, they'll stagger. Staggers prevent the boss from being able to move, allowing the knight to continually attack them. However, in 1.2.2.1, the cap on the number of times bosses could stagger was very low, resulting in runners being able to reach this cap during certain boss fights, at which point the boss would no longer stagger. 1.4 would see this cap raised to 999, meaning that once the runner got the boss staggered, it oftentimes functionally soft-locked the boss and allowed for a quick and easy win. Another time, Team Cherry made a change specifically to aid speedrunners. Yzma's Tear is an ability that allows the knight to swim in acid. Normally, obtaining this ability requires the player to progress through Yzma's Grove and defeat the Dung Defender, but by precisely dashing through a narrow, spike-filled tunnel, the player can reach the area where the ability is located. In the initial release of the game, messing up this section was especially punishing. Hazard respawning is a mechanic where the game will respawn the knight if they touch objects like acid or spikes. If the player touches the acid, it'll still cause the game to hazard respawn, but since the game expects the player to have Yzma's Tear at this point, the respawn is in acid. Since Team Cherry knew speedrunners were going for this skip though, when they released the 1.1 update, they moved the hazard respawn from the acid and onto a ledge, making mistakes in this section significantly less punishing. In many ways, Hollow Knight and Team Cherry show the balancing act certain development teams take towards speedrunning. In instances where there's only upsides, such as donating to charity or preventing softlocks, it's easy to side with speedrunners, but when it's a choice between speedrunning and the driving vision of the game, adverse changes are more likely to be made. The extent of control that the developer exercises over their game is similar to the relationship between the author and the reader. In traditional literary criticism, an emphasis is placed on the intentions and perspective of a book's author to discern the meaning of the text. This creates a frame of interpretation in which the author has a singular power over the meaning of their work. Roland Barthes challenged this view in his 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, arguing that the author should be removed from consideration when it comes to interpreting literature. Instead, the meaning should be derived from each individual's interpretation of the work, with primacy being placed on the details they notice or experience they approach it from. As Barthes puts it, the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. In this sense, once the author has finished writing and the book is published, they no longer have any power over their work. It isn't as straightforward when dealing with a series though. Each new entry allows the author to reshape the narrative, adding and changing details however they see fit. Much like authors, developers can always make a sequel. Especially when the next game is on the same console of its predecessor, many teams will use the older game as a base to speed up development. This includes anything from assets and textures to the underlying code and physics. A prime example of this is Heavy Iron Studios, which developed SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom in 2003, then released the SpongeBob SquarePants movie game less than a year later. With such a tight turnaround, reusing the core functions allowed the studio to meet the production deadline. That said, changes were still made which had a large impact on speedrunning. One of the defining aspects of BFBB speedrunning is its one-frame damage boosts. When SpongeBob takes damage, an animation plays showing that he was hurt. At the very end of the animation, there's one frame where SpongeBob is considered to be on the ground, even if he's actually in the air. While in this grounded state, it's possible to perform any ability which SpongeBob can normally perform on the ground, such as bowling, jumping, or bashing. This has widespread utility in the game, with it being used to perform sequence breaks at several different parts of the run. The most infamous of these sequence breaks is located in Sandy's Dream. This level is a massive slide leading to a giant acorn. Doing the slide casually takes several minutes, requiring Sandy to go through the lower part of the skull, traverse a mess of flowers and manure trucks before looping through the skull's eyes and scaling an oil drill before going through the center of the skull and eventually descending to the giant acorn. All this can be skipped by disabling the game's out-of-bounds detection. This allows Sandy to glide across to the acorn, but unfortunately, Sandy's hover cannot reach the top of the nut. Runners must instead activate a checkpoint trigger, then die in a nearby manure truck. A faster trick known as Fast Nut exists, which allows Spongebob to perform a bash off of a slide to reach the end, but due to how routing works in BFBB, this can only be performed near the end of the run. This creates a balancing act of doing the spatula earlier but slower, or later but faster. Fortunately, another trick exists which allows the spatula to be completed as quickly as Fast Nut, but allows it to be collected in mid-game. Referred to as Pause Nut, the trick is one of the most intricate in all of BFBB. Players must first activate an explosive T-key. This functions as essentially a timer, meaning that the rest of the trick must be set up before the bomb detonates. After this, Spongebob must be wedged between these two T-keys. When Spongebob is stuck between objects, the game wants to push him out. It does this by displacing Spongebob a large distance within a single frame. Runners must time being displaced until right before the T-keys explode. The next step is to bowl on the frame of displacement. The bowling ability causes Spongebob to creep forward, with the speed of the creep being related to the speed Spongebob is moving on the frame the player bowls. For instance, if Spongebob is not moving when he bowls, he will tiptoe forward at a speed of 0.6 units per second. If he bowls while walking, the speed of the tiptoe will be increased to 5 units per second. If Spongebob is walking on a moving surface, this will also be factored into the speed. In the case of Pause Nut, this Spongebob is displaced such a large distance on the frame he bowls, his speed is in the hundreds. Now, if the runner timed their bowl right, the Tiki should be exploding right when Spongebob bowls. Since Spongebob is still near the Tikis, he'll take damage, cutting the bowling animation short. While Spongebob stops bowling, the momentum of the bowl is preserved, and since he has just taken damage, it's possible to perform a grounded input after the animation is played. By performing a bash after the animation, Spongebob will soar towards the acorn and land on a small ledge, from which he can climb up and collect the spatula. In Heavy Iron's follow-up to Battle for Bikini Bottom, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, a few changes were made that significantly impacted how damage boosts are used. Rather than bashing being a one-frame trick after taking damage, the game will buffer the input. This means that, after taking damage, the player can hold the bash button, which the game will interpret as being pressed on the first actionable frame. This means one-frame bashes are significantly more trivial to perform in movie. This rebalances the risk assessment of going for such tricks. Now, it is viable to do a damage bash just to cut a corner and save a few seconds, whereas such bashes in BFBB require a much greater incentive to go for. This change is weirder than it first appears though, as it doesn't affect one-frame jumps. This is specifically important when playing as Patrick, as he doesn't have a bash ability. Levels where Patrick needs to perform damage boosts are significantly harder than ones done as SpongeBob. For instance, one of the most infamous skips in movie is the floating block skip in the level Now That We're Men. In this level, the token is right at the beginning, but it's too far for Patrick to jump to. In order to reach the token, Patrick needs to cartwheel into the spikes of the block while the block rotates. While taking damage on these spikes normally bounces Patrick slightly, the upward rotation of the spikes increases the height he gets. This, combined with a one-frame jump, allows Patrick to just barely reach the token, saving well over a minute. There was a much more significant change that developers added though, which fundamentally altered speedrunning between the two games, and it was done with a single line of code. No trick in Battle for Bikini Bottom is more iconic than cruise boosting. By performing a bowling attack on the same frame as a missile, the game will start the bowl, but it'll be immediately interrupted by the missile. This makes the game function as if the bowl has never ended. Since the bowl pushes SpongeBob forward, interrupting the bowl causes SpongeBob to continually be moving. It ranges from as small as a speed boost of around 10% all the way up to dozens of times faster. A prime example of how game-breaking this glitch is can be seen in the Graveyard Lakes level. Here, SpongeBob is supposed to platform and wall jump his way across the level before shooting an oil tanker. This causes the goo level to lower, revealing 2 golden spatulas. One of them can be reached by walking across the bowsprit of one boat before jumping down to a second ship, but the other spatula requires paying 2,700 shiny objects, then navigating a tight path while in SpongeBall form, and racing against the timer. All in, these spatulas take several minutes to collect casually. Cruise boosting completely breaks this. By using a more advanced form of cruise boosting known as an uncapped cruise boost, Spongebob is moving at roughly 10 times his normal movement speed. He can use this to clip through a wall and go under the goo, where he can just barely stand on the SpongeBob path and navigate his way to the spatula's cage. He then continues on the sunken ship with the other spatula, after which he clips through the goo and continues to the end of the level. This segment underscores the depth that cruise boosting adds to BFBB speedrunning, as well as how it raises the ceiling on the game's potential. In contrast, the movie game does not have cruise boosting. With the single line of code, the developers removed the single most impactful glitch in the game. Whereas BFBB allowed the player to press the bowl and the missile at the same time, Movie no longer tries to activate the abilities on the same frame. This seemingly small change fundamentally altered Movie speedrunning, as everything else was still there. This is seen in another way that the bowl can be interrupted: bungees. In both BFBB and Movie, if the player bowls into a bungee hook, it'll stop the bowl but preserve the momentum, giving the same effect as a cruise boost without requiring the cruise bubble. While neither speedrun uses this tech to great effect, in the case of Movie, its existence shows how even small decisions by developers can completely change a speedrun. Despite this, even if it was possible to cruise boost in Movie, it would still be less useful since BFBB gives you the cruise bubble roughly 53% of the way into the game, whereas the guitar is only unlocked in Playtopolis, Movie's very last platforming level, greatly limiting its potential. Before we dive into another case of developers hating speedrunners, it's time for a quick quiz. You have 5 seconds to name the highest grossing media franchise of all time starting now. Okay, pencils down. Post your answers in the comments. Generating over 50% more money than any other franchise ever, Pokemon has grossed over $100 billion since 1996. While some developers show their hatred through malice or incompetence, others make it clear through their negligence and apathy. No studio demonstrates this combination more than Game Freak and their approach to the recent Pokemon installments. All it takes is a quick look at the franchise's rating trend to see how little care is being put into new releases. When Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was announced, many were excited to explore the first open-world games in the series. When the game came out though, it was a bug-ridden mess. Even more importantly though, it seemed like Game Freak had no interest in fixing any of these issues. For instance, an issue that was present at launch was a memory leak when players entered cities. A memory leak is when a program fails to properly release memory it no longer needs, causing it to use more and more system resources over time. Normally, a well-optimized game reclaims unused memory to keep performance stable, but here, memory kept piling up until the system could no longer handle it. This caused the game to gradually slow down, leading to severe lag, frame drops, and even crashes. Despite widespread complaints, Game Freak did little to address the problem, leaving players to deal with worsening performance the longer they played. Luckily, there was a way players could fix the problem for themselves. By quitting out, closing the game, then relaunching it, the game would properly clear the memory. Functionally, Game Freak found a way to force gamers to take a break. For speedrunners, this means needing to reset their console in the middle of runs in longer categories, which amounts to a complete waste of over 30 seconds solely because the developers determined it wasn't worth fixing. To this day, nearly 2.5 years later, this problem remains unpatched. Instead, Game Freak set out to develop a 2-part DLC, which cost $34.99. Funnily enough, the much more well-liked games, Pokemon Black and White, also cost $34.99. While these DLCs introduce a large amount of new content, they fail to address the underlying performance issues which plague the games. Not only that, but the DLCs made the issues even worse. The DLC made it so that loading the Team Star Poison Crew base would occasionally take several minutes. What makes this even worse is that it isn't even consistent. Had the load been consistently slow, it could at least be accounted for and expected. With it being seemingly random, runners would have no clue if they were going to lose 2 minutes of time until nearly 3 hours into the run. The issue is compounded by the version of the game that speedrunners use. Runners can either use a cartridge of the Pokemon Scarlet or Violet, or download a digital copy through the Nintendo eShop. While this may seem like a rather small difference, the digital copy runs the game significantly faster by moving it from the SD card and into internal storage. While a faster version is hardly a bad thing, using the digital copy has the rather significant drawback of being unable to downpatch. This means that if runners want the benefits of using digital, they must play on the most updated patch. What's even worse is that this is becoming a pattern for Pokemon games. The first mainline Pokemon games to feature DLCs were Sword and Shield. Upon release, these DLCs significantly slowed down load times. The issue was significant enough to warrant a category split between updates, with the 1.0 boards of both Sword and Shield having a single run uploaded in over 4 years. Even for this single run to be submitted though, the runner had to use a physical cartridge, thus sacrificing a significant chunk of time compared to digital releases. What may be the worst thing though, is that the game still ended up being faster after the entire DLC was released. Despite the DLC making the game run slower, the content added gave runners access to much higher level Pokemon than they could previously catch. This allowed them to beat the rest of the gyms and battles more quickly than routing relying primarily on starter Pokemon, saving time over pre-DLC runs despite both the DLC detour and the loading lag. Since the beginning of the franchise, Pokemon has been among the most iconic series in speedrunning. Few games and communities have developed as legendary runs, requiring optimization for every step of the journey. From the start, Pokemon speedrunners have always found ways to push the limits of these games. But after 2 successive generations of mainline titles being unoptimized cash grabs, it's clear to speedrunners and casual Pokemon fans alike that Game Freak is resting on its laurels, apathetic to the concerns of the players. At this point, the studio knows that regardless of if the next entry in the series is any good, the games will continue to sell out, and the franchise will further separate itself from the likes of Mickey Mouse and Winnie the Pooh. Special thanks to Pulse Effects for help with this section of the video. His channel is dedicated to Pokemon speedrunning, so if you want to learn even more about the highs, the lows, and everything in between these runners face, you can find his link in the description. Perhaps the most damning example of developers hating speedrunners though, is the story of Back 4 Blood. Back 4 Blood was released in 2021 by Turtle Rock Studios. With Turtle Rock being the developers of the Left 4 Dead series, and due to all the similarities the games share, Back 4 Blood is often viewed as Left 4 Dead's spiritual successor. Both are built around fast-paced team-oriented combat where teams of up to 4 players battle against hordes of enemies. Additionally, both games feature an adaptive AI which governs the game's difficulty and pacing through controlling enemy spawns, item placements, and random events. While the core mechanics are very similar between the franchises, one of the most important differences is the use of progression systems in Back 4 Blood, namely the deck building system. The player starts with an initial deck of cards, with more cards being unlocked as the player progressed. This allowed players to customize their decks, allowing them to craft specific builds that fit their playstyle. For instance, if a player enjoyed using snipers, a card like Patient Hunter may be picked due to it granting up to 30% more damage based on how long the player has been looking down the scope. Alternatively, players that struggle to stay alive may opt to use Second Chance, which grants an extra life, additional health, and bleed out resistance, all of which greatly increases survivability. In all, decks held up to 15 cards, and with nearly 200 cards that players could choose from, the combination of decks were nearly limitless. These cards were split into 4 affinities: Reflex, Discipline, Brawn, and Fortune, as well as 7 categories: Offense, Defense, Utility, Mobility, Ability, Stat, and Talent. As you can imagine, speedrunners gravitated towards mobility cards. Cards like Fleet of Foot, which when added granted the player with plus 10% move speed, became essential for speedrunning builds. Since the effects of each card in the deck stacked, this allowed runners to create decks which were specifically geared towards moving fast, which naturally they did. Days after the game's launch, Maxilobe did a run where he completed the entirety of the game's campaign in under 2 hours. This immediately caught the attention of Turtle Rock Studios, who posted their congratulations on Twitter just a few days after the run was posted. At this point, all signs pointed towards Back 4 Blood being a promising young speed game with the blessings of its developer to thrive. Unfortunately though, this is just about where the good news ends. With the game being so new, patches were a foregone conclusion. Bugs exist, balancing is needed, and a community waits with bated breath to see the results. It started with a November 2021 patch. While mobility wasn't the primary focus of this patch, Turtle Rock added one feature that fundamentally changed how the game functioned for everyone: acceleration. Acceleration is the rate at which an object's velocity changes over time. Prior to this patch, players could reach their maximum movement speed immediately when they started moving. While adding acceleration didn't impact the maximum movement speed players could reach, it both made it so reaching that speed took time while also consuming the player's limited stamina at suboptimal speeds. Since players frequently need to slow down, this has a dramatic impact on builds based around stamina usage like speed decks, in addition to just generally making the movement heavier. The primary purpose of the November patch though was to address issues with certain builds. When certain metas clearly outpace the rest of the playstyles, developers have 2 real options. They can either make underutilized options more viable by making them stronger, or debuff stronger options to bring them in line with the rest of the game. Turtle Rock chose the debuff route, leading to one of the most popular builds in the game, which focus on melee attacks, having its effectiveness greatly reduced. The December update was when it all came crashing down for speedrunning though. We noticed that the use of speedrunning decks was creating tension between players, as a single player would utilize a speedrunning deck to separate from the rest of their team to rush ahead to finish the level. We made the following changes to bring speedrunning more in line with the viability of other strategies and builds. And just like that, Turtle Rock cut the legs out from under speedrunners. The deck that runners used now took more damage, was 14% slower, had 30% less stamina, with the remaining stamina being less efficient. Perhaps the biggest kick in the teeth came from how the developers decided what to patch. After Turtle Rock shouted out Maxilob's run, the speedrunning community assumed that the dev team was open to working with speedrunners to balance the game and make it fair for normal players without ruining the experience for speedrunners. This led some runners to reach out to Turtle Rock and provide feedback. The illusion of civility quickly came tumbling down when this very feedback made up the bulk of what ended up being patched out. It's worth calling attention to a mobility card that wasn't changed in the December patch, On Your Mark. This card gave players 15% more movement speed for 30 seconds after leaving the starting safe room. Since most levels in the campaign begin in a safe room, this functionally meant that in nearly every level, runners would be 15% faster to start out, which, needless to say, is rather massive. With most levels ranging from under a minute to just a few minutes, 30 seconds of increased movement speed contributes to a huge portion of levels being done faster. Of course, nothing good can ever last, and by the February 2022 patch, On Your Mark would be changed past the point of being recognizable. While the specific effects of the card would vary over the next 6 months, with all of them being rather useless to speedrunners, the more telling change is the condition precedent to the effect. Rather than being on exit from the safe room, On Your Mark is now activated on a horde being triggered. The anti-player mentality Turtle Rock adopted extended well past damaging the game from a speedrunning perspective. At the time of this video, Back 4 Blood averages a few thousand players on Steam. In contrast, Left 4 Dead 2, released in 2009 and seen as the spiritual predecessor to Back 4 Blood, still averages around 30,000 players online at a time. While it'd be inaccurate to attribute this difference in player counts to the game's speedrunning scenes, attributing it to acts of a development team which restricted the ability of players to derive their own interpretation of how the game should be played would be fair. Special thanks to Maxilob for help with this section of the video. You can find his channel linked in the description. Of course, the relationship between speedrunners and developers doesn't have to be this way. Let's go back to Mascot Horror for a moment. If you know one speedrunning creator in this space, it's AstroSpiff. Spiff played through a new Mascot Horror game titled Finding Frankie, which takes a mirror's edge approach to the genre. After finding the game surprisingly fun, Spiff decided to do a few runs, and shortly thereafter, a community began to form. The developers soon began patching out tricks that speedrunners used. Spiff ended up reaching out to the developers and convinced them that speedrunners were good for the game. While not all developers are as receptive, cooperation like this demonstrates how the right speedrunners and developers can work together to find common ground, creating a more enjoyable experience for all players. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. Also, if you could share it with a person or two, it really does make a difference. Seeing all the support this channel has received helps motivate us to keep making videos. If I missed any examples of developers hating speedrunning, feel free to leave them in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.